Hi everyone, and thank you for joining WCN and SHL on today's webinar, Do You Have the Right Leaders to Drive Strategic Change? Just to start off with, I'll go over the afternoon's agenda. First of all, we'll just cover some general housekeeping. We'll give you a brief overview of WCN and the speakers' bios. I'll then pass you over to SHL, who will discuss the current landscape and the issues within the public sector, the capability today and what's the starting point, the capability for tomorrow, what's required to lead this sector through cultural change, and how to drive cultural change and where to start. First of all, to the left is the GoToWebinar viewer, which you will see the presentation, and to the right is the GoToWebinar control panel, where you can raise your hand to ask questions and select the audio mode. At the end of the webinar, you will get an opportunity to ask questions, so if you do have questions throughout the webinar, feel free to ask them and we can answer them at the end of the webinar. WCN is a leading supplier of public sector e-recruitment systems, working with many clients over a 20-year history, including the HMRC, DFID, Welsh Assembly, and over 20 local government clients, plus many universities, police and fire and rescue. WCN also provides the e-recruitment technology for the UK central government, working with organisations such as the Ministry of Defence and Department for Work and Pensions. This experience has enabled us to create a future-rich, off-the-shelf public sector solution that can be rapidly implemented, reflecting both your processes and our brand. Now to meet the speakers. Barry McNeil from SHL is Managing Consultant in Professional Services Solutions Consulting. Barry has over 13 years of professional consulting experience across the people, talent and development spectrum. He has recently joined SHL after a time as the Head of Delivery and Design at Imparta, a global performance improvement consultancy. Barry has a proven track record of consistently delivering long-term value to his clients through creating and matching effective solutions to address critical business issues. With one global telecoms provider, he designed and implemented a top talent program within the UK division, delivering in excess of 2 million value back to the organisation within the first 12 months. This program was a finalist for the Learning Awards in 2013. He is a qualified user of a number of psychometric instruments, including OPQ and the Leadership Judgment Indicator, and he has used and applied these in multiple different contexts. He is an NLP practitioner, a certified coach, and a CIP qualified learning practitioner. He graduated with his distinction in his MSc in Strategic HR. I'm Sarah Callery. I have 16 years experience in the recruitment sector, both in the UK and internationally. I have a complete understanding of the 360 recruitment process, having worked previously for leading brands such as Hays, Personnel and Monster Worldwide. My role at WCN is to align complementary partnerships that will add value to WCN's applicant tracking solutions and our clients' recruitment processes to continue building on WCN's market-leading proposition and ensure our clients can attract the top talent to their organisations. Now I'm going to pass you over to SHL and Barry.
As a guest speaker on this particular webinar. So the question that is being posed in front of us is, do you have the right leaders to drive strategic change? And as we go through the content of this program, we're going to be looking at this in the particular context of the public sector. So let's first of all shine a light on the public sector and really look at some of the stories that have been in the press and the media recently with regards to the public sector. And there's been a real centre of attention limelight put on the public sector in recent times. A lot of this focus has been critical, has been really looking at where are things within the public sector failing, where are certain public sector organisations missing on delivering on their core services and delivering against their core purpose. And when you begin to look underneath these headlines and these stories, a lot of the types of issues that are coming up are real cultural issues, things that have been affected, for instance, by the significant tightening of budgets or the overall increased demand for services. These external pressures, therefore, putting significant...
Welcome to GoToWebinar, Web Events Made Easy.
And underlying all of these, when we're starting to look at these types of cultural issues, there's a real strong emphasis that must be placed upon the leadership of these organizations. So first of all, we're going to start by looking at an example from the NHS. The NHS historically and in more recent times has been under a huge amount of pressure to do more with less, certainly in the context of significant social change and social trends. So for instance, an aging population, lifestyle factors, and the impact of progress in medical advancement itself has put a lot of pressure and demand on the services of the NHS. Now, a very recent and very unfortunate example of where this failing has come to light is within the Francis Report. This is probably the most visible and most critical example of a public body failing to meet on its key core purpose and obligations. And this is in essentially looking at the work of the Mid Staffordshire Foundation NHS Trust between the years of 2005 and 2009. And a lot of the failings that came through from the Francis Report was really pointing at such situations where doctors, for instance, were keeping their heads down instead of speaking out when things were going wrong, a focus on targets and hard objectives rather than looking at the core purpose of providing patient care. And it really raised the question of how could an organization that is set up specifically to provide compassion, provide care to their patients, fail in achieving these objectives. And the underlying thread of what came through within the Francis Report was that what had been fostered and nurtured within the Mid Staffordshire Foundation NHS Trust was a culture of neglect, a culture that ended up looking at the more forceful style of management, target-driven, very objectives and hard metrics-driven type of culture, which in the process of focusing on those elements resulted in lower staff morale, in a lack of accountability or responsibility for the patient care and well-being, and essentially encouraged a lack of compassion and uncaring attitude. And where the Francis Report really focused on pointing the finger here was actually at the weak leadership. So the Francis Report highlighted the challenges that came through as a result of leaders being unsupportive in terms of offering the right level of support to managers and staff, decision making that was confused, and poor clinical governance. These elements of weak leadership were the factors that were the conclusion of the Francis Report. And certainly the quote and the second half of that slide shows the value that the Francis Report ultimately placed on what should leaders be doing in order to be bringing around the right type of culture to support and drive and meet the core purpose of the organization. Now, certainly working on leadership of Mid Staffordshire Foundation Trust is something that the Francis Report came to the conclusion was critical. Now, from that particular example, although we were looking at the NHS, we can actually see that there are huge similarities across different parts of the public sector, as with other sectors too. That the role of leadership is fundamental in creating the right type of culture, the right type of organizational environment where people can deliver excellent results for the benefit of their end users. So what does strong leadership look like in such a complex and changing environment? SHL has a model that looks at both management and leadership. And we'll look at leadership from the context of transactional leadership, which is essentially about managing the system and making sure the system runs effectively and efficiently. but also transformational leadership, which is about creating, developing, or changing direction. And the SHL model of leadership advocates that both are necessary. Both are required in order to make sure that the organization can function and can deliver as effectively as possible. Certainly the management of existing systems and maintaining that stability, maintaining that level of control in the way that the organization functions is incredibly relevant, but that needs to operate hand in hand with the transformational side, which looks at creating and influencing people such that they share common goals, values and attitudes and can work towards effectively achieving the organization's vision. So to look at this model in more detail, here we can see the 4 key stages of the SHL leadership model, which looks at a functional leadership cycle. And it starts off with the developing the vision. So at the developing the vision, the strategy is critically important in order to make sure that people are really aligned with what needs to happen within the organization. And our research has shown that there are 2 key aspects to that strategy in developing the vision component. One which is very transactional because it's looking at analysis and interpreting analysis, but also the transformational edge of that or side of that, which looks at how you create and conceptualize that strategy. Likewise, when we move through to sharing the goals, the communication is vitally important in terms of influencing and engaging people with that vision. But there are 2 aspects to sharing the goals, both one that is very transactionally focused around how people can adapt and cope with that, but one that's really about presenting that, communicating that and engaging people with that vision. The next area around gaining support is then about focusing in on people and making sure that people are motivated and empowered by the vision that is being put forward. And again, that has both a transactional and transformational component to it. And then finally, delivering success, so the operational focus on that, which is about delivering operational efficiency. And from our research, again, SHL have identified both a transactional and transformational component to it. So let's look at those both the transactional leadership and transformational behaviors in more detail to enable us to really identify the differences we're talking about. So we start first of all at the developing the vision. There you can see both that transactional side on the left-hand side of the screen, which looks around the analysis of problems and the application of expertise in terms of identifying and diagnosing where we need to go to from a vision point of view. But the transformational side is then about creating new concepts, new frameworks, new guidance for people around what that vision could look like, what that future could look like, so that there's that direction for people. When we get on to sharing the goals, again, the transactional side is about adapting and coping, so helping people to respond and adapt well to pressure and change, but also recognizing the need to inspire, to interact and present to people so that we're really persuading others and influencing others to get behind the goal. And that leads us on to gaining support, which is from a transactional managerial focus level about supporting and coordinating with others, but then also being really decisive and initiating action, providing that strong leadership to get people to support the overall vision. And then finally, that delivering success, the behaviors there from a transactional point of view are very much about the organizational execution of results, but from a transformational perspective, being about enterprising and performing. And I think to bring this to life, one example, so we conducted some work sometime recently with Sunderland City Council, and they were put in, as many organisations within the public sector have been, under significant pressure following budget cuts. So there was a real requirement for them to make radical changes about how they went about doing that. So there's obviously some transactional work that had to be done in terms of analysing where they were currently and what the impact of the budget cuts were going to be. But they also adopted a transformational aspect in terms of looking at what could we achieve if we look at this in a different way. And particularly because Sunderland City Council, they're one of the largest employers in the North East. So the impact of needing to make job losses or redundancies was going to be potentially devastating, particularly for the at the local community level, but for the local economy. It would have a significant impact on how their economy and their community were going to withstand the kind of current climate. So what they looked at was, rather than purely adopting a transactional focus to this particular challenge ahead of them, was to look at it in a very transformational way. So they made a commitment to address this issue whilst committing to no redundancies. So they embarked on a very transformational agenda. And the objective of that was to improve engagement, carry out a program of redeployment, but whilst they were doing that, really manage negativity from staff, really make sure that the people going through the redeployment process felt like they were moving positively towards a new role opportunity within the council, rather than being forced to or being backed into a corner that meant that they had to be redeployed. And that, I think, really shows the value of both the transactional aspect of leadership, but the transformational as well. The next slide here, I've got as an example here, really helps to show, and this links back to the Francis report and Mid Staffordshire NHS Foundation Trust, where some of the behaviours that could really help them to refocus on are critical behaviours for driving a culture for care. So from our analysis, we've looked at a number of core competency or core behaviours which are drawn from SHL's Universal Competency Framework. And here you can see that by focusing on these types of behaviours, the organisation would be able to move more towards a culture for care. So making sure that as a priority, adhering to principles and values of shared values, care and compassion, putting that at the heart of what the organisation would be doing would really help reinforce and bring the organisation back to what the core values of compassion and patient care are all about. So putting patients first, so delivering results and meeting customer expectations, is a core behaviour in putting patients first, really listening and understanding and putting their needs foremost in terms of what the organisation is doing would again help embed that culture for care. And then the other behaviours there then are helping to position the importance of the values and the patient care right at the forefront of what the organisation would be doing. So creating a compelling vision, critically analysing and questioning data, and building strategic partners to enable that to happen. So those are some of the critical behaviours that the NHS Trust would need to put in order to drive that culture for care. Let's now look at how the organisation might go about doing that. And I think the first thing we want to look at is we want to look at two particular aspects of leadership potential. In 2012, SHL conducted a significant piece or culmination of a significant 5-year piece of research when we published our talent report. And within the talent report, what we looked at leadership potential for today and the leadership potential for tomorrow. So to get to that point, we reviewed leadership potential across significant geographies and multiple sectors. And the lens for today was really looking at who are the leaders in the global population today that have that are potential for top leadership, and who are the people, what's the kind of group of people that have the potential to be leaders for tomorrow. And if we look at the kind of results that comes out from that, the key question for us here is not around whether there is leadership talent, it's around how good we are at recognizing the talent and developing it. And that's why it's so important to not just be aware of today's leadership potential, but also the potential for tomorrow. So if we look at the across these 4 aspects of the leadership function, let's look at what are the areas that differentiate leaders of today from tomorrow. So in the light blue color, you can see that's the people who have very high leadership potential for today. The dark color is people who are the leaders for tomorrow, and what that leadership potential is for tomorrow. So the leaders of today have the strongest behavioral repertoire to be effective leaders. They're stronger in the more managerial behaviors that build effective relationships with people, can drill down to the essence of a problem and evaluate the data and identify a solution, and can organize and mobilize resources and adapt to challenges and change effectively. They're also stronger in the leadership behaviors that can engage and influence others to get things done. By communicating effectively to gain the support of others, they can also think laterally and bring new insights and have the drive to see things through. But analysis of the data shows that actually it's just a very small number, that's 1 in 15 managers and professionals fit into that category. If we open that to the potential for leaders for tomorrow, the next tier of potential leaders includes those who can exhibit strength in some of the key behaviors, but at the moment they lack fully rounded potential. These are the people who would benefit from additional development, and we've called them the leaders for tomorrow, simply because they've got a longer personal journey in order to become an effective and rounded leader. Now, from a supply side, 1 in 3 managers and professionals have this level of leadership potential, so it's 6 times more than the leaders for today tier, and that's an encouraging message. The next aspect of the research that we really looked at was then looking at the industries with the strongest leaders for today and tomorrow, and how they really compared. And the results for this were quite illuminating. If we look first of all at the strongest leaders for today, so the public sector is up there as joint first in terms of the industries with the strongest leaders for today. So a very encouraging message for having the right leaders in place for where the public sector are currently. However, when we move to looking at the industries with the strongest leaders for tomorrow, there's quite a significant leap in terms of where the public sector is, having dropped down from the top first place down to the being number 17 out of the industry sectors. Now that is a really alarming statistic, and something that I think causes us to really ask some serious questions around what are we doing in order to attract and nurture people with potential future leadership within the public sector. The other aspect that we have been looking at is then really about how we can be driving cultural change and how we can drive it at all levels within the organization. And certainly when we were looking at the example for the Mid Staffordshire Public NHS Foundation Trust, for them there was really about driving that cultural change at all levels within the organization. And here's a real kind of model for what are the important factors that we need to look at for driving cultural change at all levels. It really starts with the values and behaviors that need to be consistent at all levels. And those values need to be owned, they need to be cascaded down from the board to all levels within the organization. And that then needs to feed through all aspects of the employee life cycle, right from recruitment, or pre-recruitment when you're attracting people in, making sure you're attracting people in with the right values, the right behaviors in order to bring or embed the values of the culture through the organization. And then as they're brought in through recruitment and selection, then how those values and behaviors are encouraged and nurtured through performance management, through the development of individuals, and then succession planning mechanisms within the organization. And in order to help identify where we need to start, here you can see the steps to driving that cultural change. So first of all, identify what are the critical populations, who are the people who we need to make sure that have got the right values and competencies and behaviors in place that are going to drive the cultural change we need to see. And then from that, can we then translate that into our strategy, into our values and behaviors, and also into our talent management strategy, so that within all of our frameworks, so our competency frameworks and role profiles, we are embedding and reinforcing the importance of the values and the critical behaviors that are going to drive the results we're looking to achieve. Then the next step would be to look at measuring the gap. So where are we currently in terms of those values and critical behaviors? Where are our current populations? So can we assess the capacity and capability of our current population? And then let's look at closing the gap. And that closing the gap can either be through developing and supporting existing staff members in how to adopt and embrace and deliver against those values and behaviors, but also recruiting in new talent, recruiting in the right talent with the right values and behaviors who are going to be supportive of the culture change program. And then beyond that, we need to then build and manage pipelines, so really proactively managing talent so that as people transition from the organization, we've got people with the right values and behaviors to slot into specific roles. Now, typically, what a lot of organizations will look at when they're identifying critical roles is thinking very much about the hierarchical structure of the organization. So thinking about it from the executive directors down through middle management, frontline management, and individual contributors. But it's also important to think about the specialists and emerging talent. Who are the other people that are going to be critical in advancing our organization and are going to have the potential and the underlying leadership potential to be our future executive directors, because these need to be managed and nurtured potentially in a different way in order to make sure that people are engaged with the future and the organization has prepared for future challenge. So, having identified critical behaviors, how can we then go about making sure that we can measure our current capability and capacity, and also look at putting an assessment methodology and mechanism in place to identify future capacity and capability? And for this, we really need to look at three broad areas. Typically, organizations will first of all focus principally upon results. So what has an individual performed previously within their role or previously when they were in another organization in order to make sure that I know that they're going to be a future performer. So the results focus tends to be on what an individual has achieved previously and their core accountabilities. However, this focus alone is only one aspect of looking at the individual as a whole. We also need to look at the competencies, so the unique blend of behavior and skills that are important and the kind of demonstrable behaviors that are how an individual goes about delivering those results. And then the other area, which is often more difficult to identify and to really explore, is the underlying potential, the hidden potential that an individual has. And that underlying potential is made up of a number of different factors, be it motivators, motivation, personality traits, underlying aspects of personal style, but also cognitive ability, the kind of hardwired ability for them to reason with data and reason with complex information. When you start to look at these three broader areas in a far more holistic way, we can then look at the current capacity of individuals and their future capability. And of course all of this has to be looked at within the context of the external environment and the organizational context. Let's look at an example of this so we can see it in more depth. So if you first of all look at person 1 and person 2, so from a results point of view you can see that person 1 is definitely an individual who is performing above average. This is a real area for strength for them. And that above average performance might be something that we would typically focus on predominantly and say they must be a future potential for the organization. Whereas if you compare them with person 2 has an average kind of current performance in terms of their results. There's definitely some room for improvement there in terms of what they're delivering on a day-to-day basis. But then when you look at the kind of competency level, in terms of how they're going about delivering it, person 1 is potentially not making many friends in the way that they're going around doing it. So they're potentially being quite dismissive of people, or being not endorsing the right values and behaviors in order to deliver those results. So there's a real kind of development area there for person 1. Whereas person 2, again in terms of competencies, is performing at a kind of average level. So they're demonstrating the behaviors required within an average way. It's only really when we look at the competency potential, that underlying aspect, that we can see the difference between today's provider and tomorrow's star. So person 1's underlying potential is average, so they're performing very well at the moment, but they may not have significantly more room for moving beyond this. They may be fairly close to the limit of their potential, some room for stretch, whereas tomorrow's star has definitely got significant underlying potential, and that's a real area of strength for them, and a place where the organization needs to focus on how they can tap into that in order to develop that person and have that person ready for future opportunity within the organization. So a few words of warning around areas to be looking out for. Certainly when we work with our clients, we can see a number of these are areas that we need to be very cautious of. So existing competency frameworks or role profiles are all well and good. However, if an organization is going through a particularly complex or challenging change, or it is really needing to drive a cultural change in a different way, then making sure that the competency frameworks and role profiles reflect the changed vision, strategy and values is critical. That is the only way that that you're going to enable or provide that framework or roadmap for change for people within the organization. Another area is really about how organizations can overlook specialist or technical pools of talent. So these are areas that really need to be nurtured, and they may sit outside the traditional hierarchy in terms of progression within the organization. However, they may be very critical in terms of delivering against the requirements of the end users within your organization. The communication is a very critical component, and failing to communicate clearly leads to all kinds of challenges whenever doing any type of audit of current capability in order to establish where you are from a leadership perspective. So making sure you've got that clear communication in place is very important. Consulting with the current leaders and stakeholders as well is an area where often organizations can go off on a tangent without necessarily bringing the leadership and stakeholders along with them. So making sure that kind of consultation is in place is also important. And then finally, making sure that the data and insight is fed into other parts of the talent management cycle is an area where, if you're not careful, it can trip you up. So quick number of ways in terms of how measuring talent can fall short. If you're looking purely at manager evaluations, you can find that there can be real challenges in how organizations measure their current talent. So manager ratings can be subject to being quite subjective and actually do not always accurately really identify talent. Generic or static competency frameworks can be limiting because they can be fail to really identify the critical attributes that are going to be talent for the future. Off-the-shelf assessments can sometimes equally be too generic and not be linked into the competency model. Also, another area where measuring of talent can fall short is around the one-size-fits-all, so not having the flexibility to change the assessment or correspond it to the appropriate level or the appropriate role. Certainly what is important for measuring an individual contributor is going to be quite different from measuring a manager or a senior manager. And then internal benchmarking, not necessarily looking externally, so you can have you can potentially have some really strong leadership potential for the future, but how that compares with other organizations in your sector can be very difficult if you don't have that level of insight. So being able to benchmark externally enables you to really identify that. So before I pass back to Sarah, just finally some top tips for success in how you go about identifying and nurturing your future talent for your organization is make sure that you really kind of understand and have a real clear view of the organization's appetite for assessment. If you're going to be introducing some kind of assessment mechanism to evaluate your future leadership potential, you really need to look at what's used now and how is this embedded and how will the organization respond to an assessment methodology. Really look to run a pilot, so involving business sponsors and stakeholders within the organization so they understand what the process is and can provide feedback on the process and how it works within the organization. Giving the clarity and transparency of the assessment data back to the business is really important. So that helps the business to see what is the value of what they have been through in terms of that process, but also what does that tell us? What are we getting from that? So we're looking not just at the high-level figures, but what is the underlying message that we can take from the data? And then really kind of consider what are the outcomes you want to achieve in the end. So start with the end in mind and really work towards that. Gather feedback along the way, so get that from participants, but also stakeholders and the leadership team. Make sure they're engaged with the process and providing that two-way dialogue throughout the entire process of the assessment, and also look for opportunities to share findings and success. So there are the top tips for success, and certainly from our point of view, we'd really wish you every success as you approach any project in the near future. I'm now going to pass back to Sarah so that we can open up the floor to any of your questions.
Thank you for that, Barry. I have got some questions coming in. Just due to time constraints, anyone that's got questions that I haven't been able to ask Barry, we will contact you directly and answer any questions. There is also the opportunity, obviously you've got my email address and Barry's email address, and you can contact us directly. First question here, Barry, is what kind of assessments can be used to identify those with the best potential to be great leaders?
Okay, thank you, Sarah. So in terms of the types of assessments that we would typically look to use, so as we kind of talked about within the presentation, that area of potential is really valuable in terms of looking at motivation, personality preferences and style, and then also cognitive ability and underlying reasoning. So using or applying the right type of assessment methodology for the level of role is very important. But typically we would look at using, first and foremost, from a personality style perspective, we would use something like SHL's occupational personality questionnaire, the OPQ. The OPQ itself breaks down the element of personality into 3 broad areas, but underneath that there are 32 different facets of personality. And the core message from that is that by really identifying what a person's personal style and preference is and how they bring that to the work environment, we can then identify their potential against specific kind of competency potential areas. So how might that play out, or that kind of blend of personality facets, how might that play out in terms of potential for certain competency areas? We would also then look at, from a motivational point of view, using something such as the motivational questionnaire, because that helps to identify where are some of the drivers and aspirational aspects that people will bring to the role. And the motivational questionnaire can look at all types of things, from kind of power and status and achievement through to personal fit with values and those types of areas. And then also from the cognitive perspective, we would use a number of different reasoning tests. So something such as the numerical reasoning and verbal reasoning, for instance, really helps to give us insight into how an individual is able to apply their cognitive reasoning to dealing with different types of information and making accurate decisions based upon that in a timely way. So those types of assessments can be particularly useful in terms of identifying potential. For measuring competency, we would look at other areas, either through 360 or through using some type of simulation exercises to help us identify that.
That's great. I'd just like to thank everyone for their time, and have a good afternoon.